Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Mark Whalan. Whalan is the Robert D. and Eve E. Horn Professor of English at the University of Oregon. He specializes in American modernism and the Harlem Renaissance. He has published 4 books: The Letters of Jean Toomer, 1919 to 1924, Race, Manhood, and Modernism in America, the short story cycles of Sherwood Anderson and Jean Toomer, The Great War and the Culture of the New Negro, and American Culture in the 1910s. Whalan's current work examines the relations between American modernism, World War I, and the development of the federal state. Thanks, Mark, for coming on the show.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Tell us first a bit about modernism. What and when was it?
Well, that's a topic that gets debated a lot by modernist scholars, but roughly it's an art movement which runs between around 1890 and probably just after World War II, and it happens across different media, so it happened in painting, in music, in writing, characterized by often a high level of experimentation. It's often seen as very difficult in terms of the demands it makes on readers or viewers or listeners. It's often characterized by a questioning attitude to the forms that artists had inherited from the past. So it involves a lot of often radical revisions of the kinds of modes of art forms which had been handed down to that generation. And it's often characterized by intense interest in interior experience, in fiction, and matching some of the very dramatic and often violent new conditions of the modern world. So I think in a nutshell, maybe that's how I'd
That's pretty good.
have a stab at it. Yeah.
What drew you to American modernism in particular?
I'd just really been interested in American literature as from my own education in England. I always loved American the 20th century literature, and that had often been defined as the American century. And there was something about, there was an energy, there was a kind of urgency to American writing in the 20th century that really appealed to me. I'm also very interested in politics and history, and African-American literature, which carries a burden of so much history and such extreme political conflict, was particularly appealing to me. So one of the things that drew me to American modernism was the Harlem Renaissance, and the writing coming from African America in the 1920s, which was just fascinating for how it was considering what it was to be in modern America, but also to be under such extreme conditions of social oppression was just fascinating to me.
So say a little bit more about, I mean, you've begun to say something about it, but say a little bit more about what is distinctive about American modernism as opposed to other modernism in Europe or Britain.
I think American modernism is often characterized by still a lingering anxiety, which was really very prevalent in the 19th century, about defining Americanness. I think in contrast to other modernist traditions, it's very nationally centered, about thinking about what's unique about American experience. Mm-hmm. And that was interesting. I think often it's less conditioned by reacting to major literary figures from its own national past. So it can feel a little freer than other traditions. I think that's not true for everybody. I think writers like Faulkner are clearly very involved with national past and sectional histories for him. So I think those are some of the features. I think it shares more than it differs mm-hmm. from other national traditions, but those might be some of the specifics.
So tell us who some of the American modernist writers that you focus on are.
Well, I've in my book on the 1910s, I wrote a little about Gertrude Stein. A lot of my work has been on the writer Jean Toomer and Sherwood Anderson. More recently, I've started to write on John Dos Passos and Wallace Stevens. So there's some of the writers that I'm dealing with.
Often the 1920s are cited as the high watermark of modernism in literature and art, but you've argued in the book that you just alluded to that 1910 was also a critical decade in American cultural history. So tell us what was important about the 1910s.
Well, it's often overlooked. When people think about American modernism, the 1920s, the Jazz Age, flappers of Prohibition, of a lot of those silent movie blockbusters that we're familiar with, kind of grabs all the oxygen and the attention. But actually, a lot of those features were happening in the 1910s. The big dance crazes that people remember about the 1920s were happening already in the 1910s. Most of when people were really figuring out what modern cinema would look like, most of those developments and most of those ideas really emerged in the 1910s, not later. And some of the most radical moments and texts in American modernism, particularly Gertrude Stein, but also T.S. Eliot, his early poetry, Wallace Stevens' early poetry, all comes from the 1910s. So I just thought that some of the chronology was slightly off, and that really a lot of the experiment that we associate with modernism or with the development of mainstream forms that were hugely influential, like cinema, was really happening in that decade. Plus, it was a decade of war, of global war, which conditioned culture in very dramatic ways, and I was interested in exploring that.
You brought up the World War I, which is obviously the most significant event in the 1910s, and you've already alluded to the incredible impacts of the war. Could you say something more about the war's impact on America and specifically?
Well, it impacted different media differently. So, for example, in cinema, before the war, American movies had been battling for space on American movie screens with European movies. But during the war, France's biggest studio, Pathé Studios, was converted into a munitions factory within a couple of years of the war beginning. And so European film production really tapered off. It allowed American movies a kind of global dominance, which allowed for bigger budgets in American movies. So American film became, and Hollywood cinema became a world cinema in those years, in ways that it continues to be. In terms of writing, I think it provided the theme for a whole generation of American writers. The generation coming up who were young during the war, whether it was Dos Passos, whether it was Hemingway, whether it was Faulkner, whether it was Fitzgerald, wrote about that war for their whole careers. They kept returning to it. And writers who were older, whether it was Wharton or whether it was Stein, returned to that war extensively too. So it had a number of impacts, and changed the tone often of American literature from being one of optimism, often being from one of a real engagement with often progressive or transformational politics, into a literature that was in a lot of ways a lot more suspicious of those big narratives or of that positivity as well.
Your book on the Great War and the culture of the New Negroes focuses in particular on the experience of African Americans during the war and the war's impact on African American culture. Tell us a little bit about African American soldiers' experience during the war.
Well, most of the African Americans who went, who were drafted, did not go to Europe. And most of the African Americans who did go to Europe didn't serve in combat units, largely for two reasons. One, because it was the racist ideology of the time believed that they would not make good soldiers, and also because the southern districts, which a lot of those soldiers came from, were very worried about African American soldiers returning home with combat training, and with the skills and the experience of fighting white troops. So only about 40,000 served in the trenches, and for the rest of them were engaged in often laborious, backbreaking work, which was essential for winning the war, of unloading boats at the docks, rebuilding roads and railways, transporting war material. For the troops at the front, it was often a very brutal and intense experience. The American war experience was not really like the European soldiers' experience, in that by the time the Americans were really there in any numbers, it was a war of quite rapid movement, of kind of panicked defensive engagements or very rapid moving advances. And African-American troops were heavily involved in that. The most famous unit, the 369th, who became later known as the Harlem Hellfighters, were actually in the line longer than any other, continuously for any other American unit, and they were welcomed as heroes when they returned home. So it was a complex history marked by some moments of demoralization and a lot of instances of not being afforded the same access, the same treatment as white troops, but some moments of great heroism which African American communities took as a great source of pride in the immediate post-war years and ever since.
Tell us a little bit about the impact on these African American soldiers of spending time in France with white people who weren't coming from the American racial context.
Well, it was a revelation for many of those troops, and the letters home and the fiction which soldiers or visitors to France made during that time is full of astonishment and joy at being at not being Jim Crowed, at not having to eat in separate facilities, at being welcomed into villages which had been ravaged by war for 4 years, and these were troops coming from a new and highly populated, wealthy nation, which French people rightly saw as being decisive in winning the war. So they were very excited about that. It made the argument that race difference and that race segregation and prejudice was natural and in some kind of ordained order, harder to sustain. And so it provided a great deal of ammunition and encouragement for a generation of civil rights activists, even as they tried to think about France's status as a colonial power and the ways in which France was maybe not as colorblind or as utopian a racial nation as some of the more enthusiastic may have reported it as. So there, in the back of a lot of that literature, that issue is there.
So the war ends. These African American soldiers come back. Tell us about what it's like for them to return to the United States after the war. What's the impact of the impact of the war on their experience once they return?
Well, I think there's a short and a long-term impact. The short-term impact it can really be seen in 1919, and that was typified by what became known as the Red Summer of 1919, which was characterized by horrendous race riots in cities like Chicago and Washington and Longview and Knoxville, and these were generally riots about competition for jobs and for residential space, as veterans of both races were returning to these cities, with very little kind of protection or support from white local authorities, police forces, National Guard. And African Americans felt as though their service, their sacrifices that they made in the World War had been for nothing. They felt as though there'd been promises made or promises tacitly made by the government which weren't being honoured in terms of a post-war political settlement. So there's a great deal of dismay about that, a great feeling of disillusionment about the possibility for an effective civil rights movement. So that's the immediate impact. In the longer term, African Americans looked to the war as a moment where kind of masculine heroism had been possible, where a kind of full martial masculine manhood had been allowed by America, which really was not allowed during peacetime. You know, that those kind of identities, that kind of behaviour, but also their experiences in France of unsegregated spaces, public facilities, and became touchstones for a generation of African Americans thinking about what liberation might be like, and looking for cultural or historical resources for thinking about what how they might build a civil rights movement for the future.
So the interwar period is the period of the Harlem Renaissance, this great flowering of African American cultural and political expression. Say a little bit about the other factors, aside from the ones you've just articulated, that contributed to this cultural flowering.
So probably the main one, and this is connected with the war too, is the Great Migration of African Americans moving from the South into the northern cities. And that had been really facilitated by the end of cheap labour coming over from Europe. Suddenly that stops in 1914, the outbreak of the war. And suddenly northern employers need labour. And the only source of cheap, readily available labour was African American Southerners. So they came north to fill those jobs. But in doing so, they built these great districts in northern cities, whether it's the South Side in Chicago or whether it's Harlem in New York. And so there's this new concentration in northern cities, which concentrates wealth, which concentrates people, which increasingly concentrated intellectuals and artists and musicians. And whenever you bring together groups like that, especially around a spirit of optimism and change and potential, then very often artistic movements can flourish. And that's what really happened in Harlem, Chicago, and Washington D.C. With the Harlem Renaissance. And also it was just a kind of auspicious moment where a number of different art forms kind of came together. So particularly music, blues and jazz had been recently developed musics. You know, they begin just really around the turn of the 20th century, 19th to 20th centuries. And they move into the cities too and change as they move into those cities. So writers were captivated by this music and often heard this music for the first time, not in the rural South, not in the levees of Mississippi, but in the streets of Harlem or the streets of Chicago. And that was incredibly exciting and motivating for a generation of artists and writers.
So how do you understand the relations between the Harlem Renaissance and American modernism more generally?
Well, I think in many ways they were addressing a series of concerns. African American intellectuals are really preoccupied with the question of defining African American culture, particularly what its unique resources are for contributing to a broader American culture. And white American writers were preoccupied with that question too. There's a great deal of formal experiment, particularly around the vernacular, about the American voice. And there's a real investment in developing the American voice, making it a literary voice in the writing of American modernism. Plus an interest in American cities, in what the nature is of American urban experience, especially as these cities had grown so rapidly. I mean, 1925 is the year when New York becomes the world's largest city, when it takes over from London. And New York literature on its own is kind of an extraordinary genre in the 1920s, and both black and white writers write extraordinary books around the nature of that experience. So those are some of the ways in which they kind of overlap.
So can you tell us a little bit about your new project?
Yeah, so my new project is, again, going back to writing about World War I. But one thing that is often overlooked, I think, about World War I is it's a kind of trial run for an American welfare state. It comes at the high water moment of progressivism in American politics, when people are talking about universal health care, where people are talking about universal military service, where people are thinking about pensions, and where the American military becomes a multi-million man organization rather than a rather ragtag and poorly funded institution. And so what the federal state can and should do is really is the political issue of the 1910s and 1920s. Often modernists are seen as people who are individualists, who don't want the state kind of meddling in their affairs, who want to get away from those kind of what's often seen as coercions. But my argument will be that actually the story is a bit more complicated than that. That's true for some modernists, but others are really excited by this expansion of connections between people, this kind of new range of what government can do, and also how you might represent that. What's the function of art in thinking about a society which works this way, and what's the right response of art to represent what that society might look like. And that really occurs with the conflict of World War I, and so I'm interested in tracking some of the different stories that emerge from how modernist writers deal with that issue.
Can you tell us an example? Give us an example of one of these texts that isn't an individualistic text that tries to figure this thing out.
Right. So an example for that might be Wallace Stevens's poetry cycle, Lettres d'un Soldat, which is based on a French soldier's letters home to his mother, which he then takes up and writes a poetry cycle based on some of those letters, which uses excerpts from those letters before every poem. But one thing that interested me about that cycle is that so many American writers embed fictional letters from home front to war front in their work. That happens in so many American novels. It was happening in the American literary magazines. There's a lot of debate about whether the Federal Mail is working well enough to manage this huge increase in letters which are being sent transatlantically. And there's also concern that before the war, that the post office is just too big, that it's become this poorly managed, gargantuan, inefficient bureaucracy, which a private enterprise would handle so much better. But what Stevens does, I think, in that collection, suggests that it's not just that the mail is not just an intimacy between respondent and sender, that it's read by military censors, it's handled by maybe hundreds of people. It involves networks which draw in a community in ways that can actually be a source of connection and a source of community. So he's interested in the letter, not in the way that we usually, or not solely in the way that we normally imagine it, as a dialogue between two people, but as a network of communication which involves many hundreds of people. And he's interested in thinking about that, how that forms a community, and how, what that might look like. So that's one example.
Interesting. So how do your students respond to you as an Englishman teaching them about American literature and culture?
I mean, they're very interested in the story about why I became interested in that. They feel it's kind of counterintuitive, which is always a great way of starting a conversation. I mean, I'm not a great believer in the idea of owning cultures and kind of having a kind of ownership over certain national traditions of culture. So it's useful to start that discussion. But I think it's also interesting for them to think about how American literature is read globally, about why someone in England or France or China might respond to this literature and might be interested. So they're interested, and it provides some lively conversation.
Do they ever object?
I haven't had any students object, but they're quite polite, most students. So they may have objections they're keeping to themselves.
You just mentioned the polite Oregon students. So what attracted you to the University of Oregon? What was it about this place that made you want to come here?
Well, the faculty working in my field are a very interesting faculty and very welcoming faculty, and that was very attractive. Um, I like the idea of working in state education, and this seemed like a great place to do that. And this seemed like it seemed like a campus which was at once very intellectually engaged and very lively and very grounded, and not too caught up in some of the pretensions that can attend the academic life. And it was a very appealing place to come and live. To move my family here, it was a very it was an appealing place.
Well, we're glad you're here. We have time for one more question, and you are the Horn Professor, and that's an endowed professorship. And as part of that appointment, you have brought speakers. Say a little bit about that aspect of your work here.
Mm. So I think being an endowed professor, kind of important for that is to try and keep the U of O connected to the national and international community of scholars. I think my favourite scholar that I brought was Louis Chude-Soki, who is working on blackface, or did work on blackface minstrelsy, and explored the tradition of, why were African American, or in the case he looked at, Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean performers blacking up and performing on America's stages and having such enormous success, and how do those figures tell us something about race relations in America and race relations now, and also why is minstrelsy such an enduring form? So that was a particularly fascinating conversation and speaker to host.
I should say that I attended that talk, and it was packed with undergraduates.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which is gratifying, and bore out his argument that that's a topic which continues to interest people and be relevant. Mm-hmm.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for speaking with us today, taking your time and sharing about your work.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I've been speaking with Mark Whalan, the Robert D. and Eve E. Horn Professor of English at the University of Oregon. He's published 4 books: The Letters of Jean Toomer, 1919 to 1924, Race, Manhood, and Modernism in America, the short story cycles of Sherwood Anderson and Jean Toomer, The Great War and the Culture of the New Negro, and American Culture in the 1910s. Thanks so much for watching.